possible. Yeah, the original version, much less being stabbed in the eyeballs with shards for 3 hours. All right. So I'm going to close out of resource intense SolidWorks. All right. We should be there now. Okay. All right. So where we were was talking about dislocation density and some of the things that happen during cold working. So the idea is the total dislocation length divided by the unit volume. So deforming sample that has increasing density has a range. A heat treatment that reduces density has a range, so that's a little bit less, as you would expect. And carefully grown single crystal has the lowest defect area in total, so the lowest defect density. The yield stress also increases as that increases. So some of the things that are happening as these half planes are trying to be moved through the material by shear, there's a couple things going on at the same time. There is the repulsion aspect, there's the attraction aspect, and then there's as the repulsion is two that are in the same direction, being almost like acting almost like a magnetic pole in a sense. So two half planes on the same side of compression repel each other, because as you try and push them together, it requires more and more energy. Inverted relations attract. So the compression side at the top versus tension side at the top, those two are more likely to attract each other together. And what you get is an annihilation of dislocation in that circumstance. So you have a half plane and a half plane, they meet in the middle and they become just a new normal plane. So you stop having the defect actually propagate through the material, because that defect is converted back into a normal atomic plane. So that should be fairly easily grasped in order to understand what's actually taking place with these. The cold working, as that increases, especially for something like low carbon steel, you do increase the effectively both the hardness and the stiffness of the material. So the slope of the Young's modulus may not change drastically, but the tensile strength does change significantly. So the yield strength increases with cold worked, and it increases significantly more with a higher cold work percentage, but then it becomes more brittle as it gets worked more and more and more. So even going to a 24% cold work, which again comes from the formula that we saw, it's the reduction in area relative to the original area based on whatever cold working process is being done. So the higher percentage of cold working, the more brittle-like the material is going to behave. The yield strength increases, the ultimate tensile strength increases to a point where we see the ductility and elasticity decreasing. So the more the material is worked, the less compliant it is, and that changes some of these properties. So the percent elongation means the ductility or the percent area reduction as it's pulled under tension is going to decrease. So either of those is going to change how it works. So the mechanical properties that change as a result of cold working are pretty critical to understand. So if we look at the yield strength, tensile strength, and ductility after cold working copper, so this is a relevant example based on something you guys are going to be doing. 15.2 millimeter original diameter. After cold working 12.2, the percent cold working gets calculated and comes out to be about 33, a little over 33%. So a little over 35.6% is what's used as the percent cold working for this particular example. The material is thinner and longer. As the percentage of cold working increases, so that was in the 30 range, the yield strength increases. So something like that's somewhere on the order of like 140, 150 or so megapascals jumps up at that 30%. It effectively doubles up to somewhere close to 300 megapascals at about 30% cold work. Similarly, the tensile strength does significant change there. So we have a range with the tensile strength starting closer to around 200 megapascals at about that 30% cold working. We're almost 300 megapascals, so almost a 50% increase for these. And at the ductility or percent elongation, so how compliant the material is at 30, becomes much less. So it's close to around 10% or so for each of these. So 300 megapascals, 340 for tensile strength, and 7% for the ductility. So a significant. Copper is very, very soft until it's cold work. Then it becomes very hard, and then it becomes brittle very quickly. And that's what this shows, is it reaches a brittle state very quickly. And around 30 to 40%, 30%, you've gotten most of the material change. 40%, you're pretty close to done in terms of improving material properties and increasing the brittle nature of the material. So it becomes very brittle at that state. Heat treatment after cold working is called annealing. This is a really key part of the process because there's a couple things that happen. As you increase the annealing temperature, so as you increase the annealing temperature, the tensile strength drops, and you have a couple different phases. So you have recovery phase, where it's recovering some of the grain compression by cold working. You have recrystallization, where it's growing new crystals and the structure of the material is changing. And then you have grain growth in this higher temperature region. So depending on which temperature you bring it to, you reach a different step in this process. The tensile strength decreases significantly once you start growing new grains. The ductility increases significantly. And that's an inverse relationship. So we want to keep in mind that that's an X. They're inversely proportional always. So higher tensile strength, low ductility, high ductility, lower tensile strength. So things can be flexible and stretchy, but not very strong, or things can be very strong and not very flexible, typically speaking. So as soon as you reach a certain temperature, in this case, I think this is annealing temperature as an example for steel. When you reach something like 300, most of your 300 to 400, especially 400, most of your improved tensile strength is gone. So the cold work is, if you had to cold work to get it into a shape, for instance, then the effects of the cold working are nullified when you anneal the material. So if you are trying to take something like a flat sheet of metal and turn it into something else, there's a lot of cold working involved, typically with hammers and forms and dies and all sorts of things. And it really helps to be able to visualize what that looks like. Let me see if I can find an example. There's cold stamping operations, but that's not what I'm looking for. So here's a bunch of examples of metalworking. So there's some examples here of mostly cold working process.
took me 30 minutes to get the job done, it's because I spent the last 10 years
So one of probably the best examples there is a heat treatment process after cutting. So this is a cold working process of the metal, and the more operations that you're doing on this. This happens to be a ring gear the size of a small moon, but they do an extremely high heat process and then relocate it to cool it again, to harden the teeth so that it's able to take the abuse. So they start out by doing the cold working process. They anneal and recrystallize, and so they eliminate the effects of cold working. Then they go into a quick quench, and that hardens the surface of the teeth. So it's what's often referred to as something like case hardening of the ring gear, and then they bolt it on this rather large industrial machine. So a lot of examples of how this actually gets used in practice. So it's important to understand the context for why we're interested in the recrystallization region and the grain growth region. To be emissive like that, it has to be above about 700 or 800 C. So they went well into the grain growth area for that, so that it can do hardening that we'll learn about later. But that was an example of material that was cold worked through cutting and then annealed, recrystallized, and then hardened. So that's what that process looks like. So especially something like the dislocation density, there's 3 stages of the heat treatment, one of which is reduction of dislocation density by annihilation, meaning they bring the 2 half planes together, so the atoms diffuse in the regions of tension, allowing for the compression and tension to balance out, and you get annihilation and become normal atomic planes again. The second scenario is where the dislocation might be blocked and can't move or something like that. So the dislocation effectively climbs again by diffusion processes of the atoms moving around, and then is allowed to move, and the opposing dislocations meet and they cancel each other out, causing annihilation of those dislocations. So there's recrystallization, and that's where new grains are formed. That means the dislocation density is very low, and they're small in size. So the cold work brass has a lot of dislocations visible here, and then new crystals show very few, so a much lower density of dislocations. The cold worked grains, where you have all of these patterns and you can see these visible lines where everything has been stretched and there's slip planes, all of that goes away as it recrystallizes entirely. The grain growth region So region 3 is at longer times, the average grain size increases. So the smaller grains shrink and ultimately disappear to give rise to the larger grains. And that continues to grow and grow and grow. So there's a empirical relation that uses a coefficient. So coefficients are just a fancy thing where we hide our ignorance about processes. And this gives us the information that we're looking for. So the annealing temperature specifically for steels, or in this case, this is for ferrous alloys. The tensile strength and ductility have this inverse relationship, and it gives you a sense of cold worked grains and recovered grains. And this is what the temperature change looks like. So the cold worked grains, the beginnings of recovery start to be seen, and then you have new grains beginning to form at those grain boundaries that grow and consume all of those older grains. They're small at first, then the smaller ones disappear to get to be bigger and bigger and bigger ones over as the temperature continues to increase. So the average grain size increases dramatically after that higher temperature. So above like 500, 600, 700. The recrystallization temperature is different for a lot of different materials, and it's the region defined by 0.3 to 0.6 of the melting temperature. That's the recrystallization region. So you're trying not to re-liquefy the metal, as you guys saw in that example with the cast iron. Cast iron has the lowest melting point, which is why it's the cheapest to make into cast iron stuff, which should make sense, because it doesn't take as hot a fire to melt cast iron as it does to melt a highly alloyed steel. So for a specific alloy, that TR depends on a couple factors, that recrystallization temperature. The percent of cold working, there's a decrease in the temperature of recrystallization with increased percent of cold working, and that's because it puts the grains into a kind of compression, a compressive stress that makes it so that it doesn't take as much energy because of the energy that's already been put into them in the cold working. They've already stored that energy in terms of defect movement. So they're already much closer to ready to recrystallize because it doesn't take as much energy to get them all the way the rest of the way. The purity of the metal, that also changes. So the recrystallization temperature decreases with increasing purity of the metal. So more highly alloyed, higher recrystallization temperature, lower alloy, lower recrystallization temperature. So something like a cylinder that was originally 10 millimeters in diameter is going to be drawn. So it's going to be cold worked through a process just like that hoop making process that you saw a couple times. The circular cross section will be maintained during deformation. So it's going through circular rollers. It's not going through like V-shaped rollers or something like that. A cold worked tensile strength in excess of 380 megapascals and a ductility of at least 15% elongation are desired. The final diameter has to be 7.5 millimeters. How can this be done? So the steps look like the just drawing to the final diameter. If you do that, you end up with a percent cold working that is 43.8% here. And the diameter reduction, we take a look at some of the materials here. 43% cold working the yield strength increases significantly. As the percent of cold working increases, that ductility decreases, and that tensile strength increases with that percent cold work as well. So brass is about 420 at 43.8%, 420 megapascals. At the tensile strength is 540, so that's above the 380 that we would need, and the ductility is 6%, so significantly less than the 15% desired. Okay, so we can't just run it through a die and extrude it that way. We have to do some other thing. So that doesn't work for what our criteria are. We can't just make something that is stronger and stiffer and less ductile and expect that it's going to do an adequate job in the design application. So this is why material spec is actually quite important. So for greater than 380 megapascals, the percent cold working needs to be about 12%. For the elongation at 15%, we need to be 27, less than 27%. So our working range is limited to 12 to 27% cold working. So you have to cold work, anneal, cold work again in order to get to the end state. So to pick something roughly in the middle, you start with 20% cold working. The diameter after the first cold work stage is smaller. So it gets calculated like so. And we end up with 8.39 millimeters is our intermediate diameter. So we reduce from 10 to 8.39. Then we heat treat and allow for recrystallization, which allows us from the material standpoint to sort of start over. Then we cold work again and reduce the diameter from 8.39 to 7.5. And then we end up with our 340 megapascals and our percent elongation falling within the design range. The other thing that's important to understand is the differences between the hot work and the cold work for all of these. There's a lot of aspects to both. There's pros and cons to both. But the idea is the hot working is deformation that happens above the recrystallization temperature. Cold working is anything that happens below. So even if the range is something, if it's like at 100 C or something, and so it's still physically warm, but it's not in the range above that recrystallization temperature, you're not doing hot working, even if the material itself isn't actually room temperature. So that's an important distinction to know. That could be a concept question that I would expect to see variations of on the test later on. So metals are typically going to have, with smaller grains, they're going to be stronger and tougher at low temperatures. Metals that have larger grains are going to have good creep resistance at relatively high temperatures. So depending on what the end use application involves, there might be a couple of differences in terms of how that works and how well. So these dislocations are observed primarily in metals and alloys, and the strength is increased by making dislocation motion difficult. So the strength of metals may be increased by decreasing the grain size, and then the solid solution strengthening, precipitation hardening, and cold working. But cold working may have to go back and forth with heat treatment and recrystallization in order to get the end desired grain properties for the application, and that's part of what it is. So a really good example of this in practice is, let me find it. Um, let's see. There's a bunch of examples of those. Yeah, a lot of old examples. I think this is the one I'm looking for. Yeah. So he's going to go through all of these processes in sequence, see if you can identify them.
Workshop. It is fantastic to have you here as ever, because on today's episode we're going to be taking a $7 Harbor Freight hammer and making it perform like a beautiful forged $200 hammer. Before we jump in, let's thank today's sponsor, which is Raid Shadow Legends, for making all of this possible. Raid is a dark fantasy RPG game that reminds me of a lot of those old school role player games back in the day, like Final Fantasy, which is fantastic. You've been hearing about Raid Shadow Legends, and it'll work seamlessly between PC and mobile. The links are in the description. We're very grateful for Raid sponsoring this. Let's jump in and turn a $7 hammer into one that performs like a $200 one. Okie dokie, so here's what we have hammer-wise. From Harbor Freight, and costing a whopping $7 right here, is a Pittsburgh 3-pound sledgehammer with a 16-inch hardwood handle. We also have a Pittsburgh 3-pound cross-bead hammer next to some forged blacksmithing hammers. Let's have a closer look. Alrighty, let me tell you some of the problems that I see with the $7 hammer. Start off with, the handle was loose off the shelf. As it came from the store, it had a loose handle, and when you're forging, you don't want the head of the hammer to be rattling around, and it can also end up being a little bit of a safety hazard, because if the head flies off, it could hit you or somebody, or put a hole in the wall or a window. No fun. The wobbly handle here is caused because the fit between the handle and the eye, the hole of the hammer, is really imprecise. So much so that they've actually jammed some epoxy, it looks like, in there, but it wasn't an epoxy strong enough to actually hold it to the head, which is a shame. So it wobbles around. No good. The biggest gripe, however, is how the faces come. The faces come very flat with just one chamfer around it, meaning that though it's chamfered here, it still has a very sharp transition between the flat and that chamfer. So if you go to forge with it, you're going to be putting a few extra hammer marks in your work that are going to be a lot more difficult to get out. It also has two identical faces. Obviously, that's normal for this style of hammer, but I am quite partial to the rounding hammer with one rounding face and one flat face with much wider radii on the edges so that you're able to have a much better degree of control over the steel and mitigate the risk of nuisance hammer marks. But with all that said, a hammer is just a lump of metal on a stick, and even with the $7 hammer from Harbor Freight, you can still make stuff, because it's a whole lot more about knowing how to make it than it is about the tools used. So let's make something. In a quick and dirty 2 heats, we're still able to make something. The hammer moves steel. It forges. The loose head threw me off a little bit, but I was able to forge a decent taper, do a quick isolation, all without a problem. The only downside is as I tried to forge out the leaf itself, those edges of the hammer really came to bite me, and that's those rather unsightly marks that you're seeing. And so we're going to tackle some of these issues. First things first, we're going to fix that handle fit, see if we need to make a new handle, see if we can fix what we've already got, and then we're going to tackle the faces. First things first, I'm going to cut off this little rag right here where the sharp head is peeling up the wood. The gap in the handle is so bad I can fit this knife blade all the way down it. I don't know if we're going to be able to fix it. That's what you get for $7. To see if we can fix it, I'm going to drive the handle further into the head. And that is the downside to this shape of a hammer handle. As you drive it down, that swell on the handle all of a sudden becomes so thick that instead of compressing into the head, it just broke off on the sharp edges of the hammer hole. The good news is, the handle is now tight. We pushed it out about 3/8 to 1/4 of an inch. You see how much gap there is in there? That's really not good. That's such a shame. What we now need to do is find a way of wedging out the material enough that it fills the top of the eye. We've got a little bit of a dilemma here. They fitted it with both a wood wedge and my least favorite of wedges, the round wedge. What I like to do in hammers that I make is fit them only with a wood wedge and make sure it's a really good fit. That means that, God forbid, the handle does come loose in time. It's a natural material, and changes in humidity can make it happen. And not having a steel wedge in means that when it does come loose, you can drive the handle down and then install a steel wedge in that new climate. So it gives you that little extra opportunity to do it. Well, now there's a steel wedge, and all we can really do to try this is try driving the steel wedge in further. And I don't know if it's going to work, because a round wedge doesn't really do a perfect job of spreading out the material the same way that first wood wedge does.
Our mom and dad own one-day concrete coatings.
They make old concrete floors look new again.
Like garage floors.
This is why I don't like these wedges. They're impossible to drive any deeper than the wood. This is not going to work. Oh boy. This was a useless wedge. I will no longer turn up my nose at this hammer, but I will strive to make it better. The reason I'm doing this is I want to make this accessible to you guys. I don't want to use all the fancy tools to get it done. I want us to try and do it a little more simply this time. The best thing to do now would be to put an entire new handle in and see if we can do it without doing that step. I want to show this in the easiest way possible. Okay, so as you saw, I took that ridiculous round steel wedge out of there. After driving the handle up through, I then pulled the wood wedge out, and I feel like if we had a wider wood wedge, we to them. I round the end slightly to match up with the rounding of the eye. I also gave the end a very thin chisel grind. I also don't want to forget, you see how we have a chamfer on the top of the wedge? That's going to save it from splitting. We're going to wood glue the wedge in. Do notice that the bottom of the handle is supported. And we're going to use the wood wedge to split the handle apart as it drives down. Starting to get pretty firm. We've actually cracked that wood wedge already. Not the end of the world. Flip it over, and then I'll hammer from the bottom of the handle. Since that wedge is starting to really fray apart, I know I'm not going to achieve anything by hammering it further. It's definitely tightened up the fit of the eye a good deal. We're going to grind off the top. Something really weird with the way this hammer's made. There's this lip here. See where that knife is hitting? So it looks like there's a whole lot more space than there actually is. So there's this weird lip. It's pretty well filled up. But there is that little lip in there at the top of the eye, which is throwing me off. So I'm gonna call the handle fit up ready. If it does come loose, I'll throw a steel wedge in. Next thing, we wanna deal with the actual handle itself, because it's nasty. It's got a varnish coating on it, which is going to give you blisters, and it's also this oval profile. I prefer handles that have a flat down the length of them. I also want a better chamfer on the end here. That's going to help reducing splitting the handle if you do ever have to redrive it. You can tackle this by locking the handle, not the head, in a vise. You really don't have to get too fancy. The handle now feels really good. It's a little slimmer up here than I'd like, but I'm happy with that. The idea is minimal effort, minimal money. Tightening the pressure, you can achieve a better surface finish, but there are also finishing discs that you can use to get an even higher polish. For me though, more interesting and the faces itself. It's definitely not as fancy as one of these forged hammers. It definitely doesn't have the fit and finish. It has longer proportions than I'd like. It's a rough old job, but it is gonna forge, and we're gonna prove it. It is so much nicer to forge with. Those edges give you so much more control. It's a much more consistent hammer blow because you know what those edges are going to do. They're softer. There's less unsightly hammer marks. This is a hammer you could forge anything with. The difference in this hammer before and after is worlds apart. So much more pleasant to use, so much more control. You can get a much more aesthetically pleasing hammer mark in it. It's definitely not the best leaf I've ever made, but it's a lot better than the first one. Because the hammer wasn't wobbling on the handle, it felt so much more comfortable to use. And this, I hope, helps show that it's not all about the type of tools that you have.
So it's key to have a couple of the right kinds of materials behaving in the right way. And there, I thought this was one of the ones where he sort of reforged one of the hammers into another hammer and made it a much better piece, but that wasn't this particular one. The concepts there are still approximately the same and allow you to get a better understanding of just exactly what it is that he's doing. So that brings us basically to the end of the core content for chapter 7. I'm going to work on getting everything ready for the exam for next week. That way we can have that in the books, because we need to get that in and get grades in so that we can do all the midtermy stuff. Questions from you guys?